Right. Hey everyone. I need like a catchy opener, like a true YouTuber. But anyway, we're gonna pick up where we left off, and so we're still just kind of introducing the field of statistics. We're just introducing what data actually is, and that's going to be the main focus of this particular video. Is what is data and what would be usually the best way to organize and store data once you collect it. And so we're going to start out with just a couple of basic definitions that we're going to use the entire semester. And so we're going to define what a case is. And so in stats, a case is just an individual observation. And so I'm going to go back to that stent study from the previous video to kind of give examples of each of these things. And so the example in that stent study would just be the patient. All right, so like nothing too complicated or anything, just who or what you're actually collecting the data on. In the stent study, you had volunteer patients. A variable is just going to be a characteristic or characteristics of each case. And so an example in that stent study, you could go ahead and take a second to think about what a variable would be in that stent study. There are, I think, two good ones. And so the example I thought of was whether or not a patient had a stroke. The other variable that you might have thought of would be whether or not the patient got the treatment. And so variables we're going to break up into two different types. And so you could have a numeric variable. And so that's going to be a variable that contains numbers. I know, what a great definition. Numeric variable, a variable that's numeric. So a variable that contains numbers, we're going to add on something so that those numbers can be added, subtracted, etc. And so in that stent study, there actually wasn't any numeric variable. And so the example I'm thinking of is kind of if you have like Spotify or Apple Music or some sort of streaming service. I guess YouTube has one too, so YouTube Music, whatever they call it. There's going to be a lot of variables that are going to be recorded for each song. So some examples of numeric variables would be like the song length, maybe the number of plays for each song would be a variable, so the number of times you've played it. Maybe the age of the artist of the song would be a variable. And so all of these are numeric because they're all recorded, like song length would be number of seconds, number of plays, the units for that would just be number of plays, age of the artist would usually be years. All of those are numbers. On the other hand, a categorical variable is just going to be a variable that contains categories. So again, stats is very example focused. The definitions sometimes can be a little bit silly, but some examples in the song kind of setting. So both of the variables in the stent study, whether or not a patient had a stroke and whether or not they got the treatment, both those would be categorical. For songs, you could think about maybe the genre of the song. So whether it's like pop or rock or hip hop or country, that would be categorical. Or maybe you could think about like whether or not the song was favorited. And so most of these streaming services have something where you can like give it a heart or a favorite or whatever, so they know that like you really like it. And so that would be categorical because either you favorited the song or you didn't. And so there's just two different categories. The categories of a categorical variable have also a particular name, and we're going to call those levels. And so levels we're just defining as the categories of a categorical variable. And so like in our previous example, like favorited or not favorited are the two levels. So there could just be two levels, or in the case of genre, there could be many different levels. Okay, and so a couple other different types of variables. These can be either numeric or categorical. So the explanatory variable we're just thinking about as a variable that might explain something in the response. And so in that stent study, remember we had whether or not the patient had a stroke and whether or not the patient got the treatment. So you could take a second to think about which one of those would be the explanatory variable. And so the explanatory in that case, it makes more sense for whether or not the patient got the stent, because we think that might explain um, whether or not they got a stroke or not. And so the response variable is just going to be a variable that might be explained by the explanatory. Okay, this is the last of our like terrible definitions that just repeat the words and what's being defined. So an example of this in our stent study is just whether or not the patient had a stroke. All right, so we'll go ahead and finish up this next section in the next video and just talk a little bit about how we would want to organize this type of data that we're collecting.